The call from Stanford's ethics committee came on a Tuesday afternoon, 17 years after I'd abandoned my PhD and fled to Berlin. Dr. Hayworth, we've found something concerning your thesis submission from 2008. My throat tightened as the committee chair explained they'd discovered my original research files in a dormant university server, files with metadata and timestamps that predated my roommate Vanessa's groundbreaking dissertation by 6 months. The same dissertation that launched her career at Johns Hopkins while I was teaching English to German businessmen and trying to forget I'd ever dreamed of becoming a neuropsychologist. We have evidence suggesting academic theft, the chair continued. Would you be willing to testify? I gripped my phone, watching my reflection in the kitchen window, a woman I barely recognized, now being asked to revisit the betrayal that had broken her. Funny how life circles back. Next week, I'd be returning to California for my father's retirement ceremony, where Vanessa, now married to my brother, would be in attendance as family. They had no idea what was coming. Growing up in Palo Alto meant living in the shadow of Stanford, the university my father had served as department chair in neuroscience for 30 years. The Hayworth name carried weight, and Dad made sure we knew it. Excellence isn't optional in this family, he'd remind us at dinner, his eyes lingering on my brother Michael's report cards, then skimming past mine despite my straight A's. For him, Michael was the golden child, varsity athlete, charismatic, destined for medical school, while I was the awkward, bookish daughter who could never quite measure up. Mom had died when I was 12, breast cancer that moved too quickly for treatment, leaving me navigating adolescence with only Dad's impossible standards and Michael's effortless perfection as guides. During my high school graduation, Dad politely clapped when I gave the valedictorian speech, then spent the evening introducing Michael to his colleagues. He's pre-med at UCLA, he'd boast, while I stood nearby, Stanford acceptance letter already in hand. I still remember the Thanksgiving of my sophomore year when I excitedly shared my research ideas about neuroplasticity in trauma recovery. Interesting, Dad muttered, before turning to Michael. How's organic chemistry treating you? When Michael admitted he was struggling, Dad spent 2 hours after dinner tutoring him, while my research notes sat untouched on the counter. I chose neuroscience partly out of genuine interest and partly as a desperate bid for Dad's approval. By graduate school, I was determined to make him see me. My PhD thesis on neural pathway reconstruction after psychological trauma was ambitious, potentially groundbreaking. I worked 18-hour days in the lab, coming home to the apartment I shared with Vanessa Coleman, another neuroscience PhD candidate whom I'd met at a department mixer. Vanessa was everything I wasn't, confident, socially adept, from a wealthy East Coast family. She'd immediately charmed Dad when I introduced them at a faculty dinner. "Now that's the kind of colleague you need, Ellie," he'd said afterward, "someone who understands how to present herself." I didn't tell him how Vanessa rarely contributed to our research group discussions, or how her preliminary data always seemed suspiciously perfect. For my 30th birthday, after years of saving, I commissioned a custom-made limited edition neuroanatomy textbook for Dad, a collaboration with a scientific illustrator friend featuring Dad's own research highlighted throughout. I spent months on it secretly, imagining his face when he opened it, finally seeing the depth of my understanding, my commitment to his field. What I didn't know then was that while I was preparing this grand gesture, Vanessa was methodically copying my research files, lab notes, and early thesis drafts. I didn't know that she had been meeting privately with my father, discussing her breakthrough theories. And I certainly didn't know that the family dynamic I'd endured for decades was about to collapse under the weight of a betrayal so complete it would send me fleeing across an ocean. The week before my thesis defense was scheduled, Dad announced his intention to host a pre-celebration dinner at his Professorville home, a surprising gesture that left me momentarily hopeful. "I've invited the department," he said over the phone, "and Vanessa, of course. Michael's flying in too." I remember standing in our apartment kitchen, gripping the counter to steady myself, overwhelmed by what felt like validation finally within reach. I spent the next few days in a frenzy of preparation, not just for the dinner, but finalizing my presentation slides, practicing my defense arguments, and wrapping Dad's custom textbook in heavy crimson paper emblazoned with the Stanford seal. The night before the dinner, I stayed late at the lab, running one final verification on my key experiment. When I returned to our apartment after midnight, Vanessa's light was still on, but her door remained closed as it had been increasingly over the past few weeks. The dinner party was set for 7 p.m. on Friday. I arrived early to help, carrying my presentation materials and the wrapped gist. Dad was busy arranging wine glasses, barely acknowledging my entrance. "Put your things in the study," he directed, not looking up. "The Morgensterns will be here soon. Richard's bringing that department chair from UCSF." The house gradually filled with faculty members and their spouses, creating that particular academic cocktail party hum, scholarly debate mingled with departmental gossip. Michael arrived with a bottle of Dad's favorite scotch, receiving a warm embrace that made my own earlier stiff greeting even more conspicuous. When Vanessa finally arrived, something felt off. She wore a navy blue dress that seemed oddly formal for the occasion, her typically casual demeanor replaced with a tightly controlled smile. She avoided eye contact with me while warmly greeting my father with a kiss on the cheek and a whispered comment that made him laugh, a sound so rare in our household that heads turned. "There she is," Dad said, his hand lingering on Vanessa's shoulder, "our department's rising star." I felt a chill despite the crowded room. "I thought this dinner was for my defense next week," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Of course," Dad replied, "but we have another announcement tonight, too." Throughout dinner, Vanessa dominated the conversation, describing research that sounded eerily familiar, neural regeneration pathways I'd been mapping for 3 years. I kept catching snippets that mirrored my lab notes verbatim. When I tried to interject, she smoothly talked over me, receiving encouraging nods from faculty members who should have recognized these theories as mine from our research group meetings. "The really innovative aspect," she was saying, "is the application to PTSD recovery patterns in traumatic brain injury patients." I nearly choked on my wine. That was my central thesis, the exact approach I'd developed after months of literature review and preliminary testing. I glanced at Dad, expecting him to correct her, to acknowledge that she was discussing my work. Instead, he was nodding approvingly. During dessert, Professor Whitman, my thesis advisor, arrived late and pulled me aside in the hallway. His face was grave. "Eleanor, we need to talk. There's been a situation with your research data." "What situation?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "Some inconsistencies have been flagged, and concerns about originality." He couldn't meet my eyes. "The defense is being postponed pending review." I felt the room tilt. Inconsistencies? That's impossible. All my data is meticulously documented. "There's also the matter of access logs showing you viewed Vanessa's preliminary research before developing your key methodology." "That's backwards," I protested, my voice rising. "She's the one who—" Just then, Dad clinked his glass for attention. The room quieted as he stood, placing his hand on Vanessa's shoulder. "Before we conclude this evening, I'd like to make an announcement." His smile, rare and genuine, was directed at Vanessa. "The department has received extraordinary news. Vanessa's research has been fast-tracked for publication in Neuron, and she's been offered an early fellowship position at Johns Hopkins upon completion of her PhD." The room erupted in applause. I stood frozen, watching Vanessa accept congratulations with practiced modesty, while Dad beamed beside her with more pride than I'd ever seen him direct at me. Then, in a moment that would replay in my nightmares for years, Dad added, And on a personal note, I couldn't be more delighted that Michael has finally found someone worthy of the Hayworth name. They've been seeing each other for several months. Michael appeared beside Vanessa, taking her hand as shocked murmurs rippled through the room. I caught Professor Whitman's pitying glance as the full scope of the betrayal crystallized before me. My research stolen, my brother involved, and my father's complicity in all of it. The wrapped textbook sat forgotten by the door as I felt 17 years of struggling for validation collapse into a single, clarifying moment of rage. The room swam before me as applause faded into uncomfortable silence. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my reaction. The dutiful daughter, the supportive sister, the congratulatory colleague. I felt something crack inside me, a fault line that had been developing for decades finally giving way. "That's fascinating timing," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "considering Vanessa hasn't produced original research since she joined our lab." Dad's smile tightened. "Eleanor, this isn't the time." "When is the time, Dad? After she's published my work? After she's accepted awards for my ideas?" I moved to the center of the room, suddenly aware of how this moment would define the rest of my life. "Professor Whitman just informed me that my defense is postponed because of originality concerns. Funny how that happens the same week Vanessa suddenly has a breakthrough." Michael stepped forward, his face flushed. "Ellie, you're embarrassing yourself. Vanessa's been working on this for how long, Michael? Since she started sleeping with you? Or since she gained access to my apartment, my computer, my lab notebooks?" I turned to the gathered faculty members. "Check the timestamps on the server files. Check the lab access logs. Better yet, ask Vanessa to explain her methodology without reading from my notes." Vanessa's composed facade began to crack. "You're just jealous because for once you're not the center of attention," she said, her voice rising. "You can't stand that your father finally sees real talent instead of obligation." The word obligation hung in the air like poison gas. I looked at my father, waiting for his denial, for some indication that his decades of emotional distance weren't what Vanessa implied. His silence was confirmation enough. "I've spent my entire life trying to earn your approval," I said directly to him, no longer caring about the witnesses to our family's implosion. "I chose your field. I worked myself to exhaustion. I defended you when colleagues called you cold and demanding." I laughed, a hollow sound that surprised even me. "And here you are, celebrating the theft of my work because it came packaged in someone you find more palatable than your own daughter." I walked to my bag and pulled out my external hard drive. Everything is here. Original timestamps, methodology development, 3 years of lab work. I have backup copies in multiple locations. I placed it on the table. "Vanessa can't defend this research because she didn't do it. She can't explain the methodology because she didn't develop it." Dad finally found his voice. "That's enough, Eleanor. You've always had this competitive streak, this need to diminish others' accomplishments. No, Dad. For once, you're going to hear me." I moved to retrieve the wrapped package by the door. "I commissioned this for you, spent months on it, a custom neuroanatomy text featuring your research, your contributions to the field." I thrust it into his hands. "That's who I am, the daughter who still tried to make you proud even when you made it clear nothing would ever be enough." The room had gone completely silent. I looked at Vanessa, whose face had drained of color, then at Michael, who couldn't meet my eyes. "Congratulations on your publication, Vanessa. I hope Johns Hopkins has a good ethics committee." I turned to my father one last time. "And congratulations to you, Dad. You finally have the daughter you always wanted. I'm done trying to be her." I walked out, leaving behind the stunned silence, the crumpled wrapping paper, and 17 years of seeking approval from people who never deserved my effort. Outside, the California night was warm and clear, stars visible despite the campus lights. I took a deep breath of freedom and never looked back. The aftermath was nuclear. I spent that night in a hotel, my phone exploding with messages, concerned colleagues, confused friends, and Michael's increasingly desperate attempts to explain. Professor Whitman called at dawn, his voice grave. The department is initiating a formal investigation. Don't leave town. But I already knew I couldn't stay. 3 days later, I was on a plane to Berlin with 2 suitcases and a shattered career. I chose Germany on impulse, far enough to feel unreachable, foreign enough to match my internal landscape. I didn't formally withdraw from Stanford. I simply disappeared, leaving the investigation, my apartment, and my former life behind. The first year in Berlin was a blur of survival German and precarious employment, teaching English at language schools, editing academic papers, ghostwriting for researchers who, unlike me, still had careers. I lived in a tiny apartment in Kreuzberg, surrounded by artists and expatriates who didn't ask about my past. I changed my name informally, going by Ellie Hayes instead of Eleanor Hayworth, shedding the weight of family expectations with each introduction. Around my second year abroad, an unexpected ally emerged. Dr. Ramira Santos, a visiting professor who had been at that fateful dinner, tracked me down through a mutual colleague. "What happened to you was unconscionable," she wrote in her first email. "The investigation stalled when you left, but not everyone has forgotten." She became my lifeline to the academic world I'd abandoned, sending occasional updates about department politics and, more painfully, Vanessa's rising star. Through Ramira, I learned that Vanessa and Michael had married 6 months after I left. Dad gave them a substantial down payment for a house in Menlo Park. Vanessa published her research to significant acclaim, securing tenure at Johns Hopkins by 35. Michael finished medical school and joined a prestigious neurosurgery practice in Baltimore. They had 2 children, their lives unfolding as if my absence was merely a footnote. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding. I started a small educational consulting business, helping German researchers prepare English language publications. I made friends, learned to navigate Berlin with the confidence of a local, even began dating occasionally. But I never returned to neuroscience research. The wound was too deep, the loss too profound. In my 5th year abroad, Ramira connected me with Dr. Kristen Weber, a neuroscientist at Charité Hospital in Berlin who needed help with an English language grant proposal. The project involved neural pathway reconstruction in trauma recovery, eerily similar to my abandoned research. After reviewing my edits, Kristen asked pointedly about my background. "You understand this material at a level no editor should. Who are you really, Ellie Hayes?" That conversation changed everything. I confessed my history, showing her my saved research files as proof. Instead of pity, she offered partnership. "Your methodologies were years ahead of their time," she said. "This field has caught up to where you were, but imagine where you could take it now." Over the next decade, I slowly re-entered research, first as Kristen's collaborator, then as a respected scientist in my own right. We published groundbreaking work on neural regeneration, carefully constructed to both build upon and definitively distinguish itself from Vanessa's stolen research. I earned a position at Charité, rebuilt my academic reputation under my new name, and found peace in the knowledge that my work was finally speaking for itself. I had no contact with my family during these years. Dad sent occasional emails that I never answered. Michael tried harder. Birthday cards, Christmas messages, even a letter when their first child was born, but I remained silent. Their betrayal had cauterized something in me. I'd cut them out like damaged tissue. Then came the call from Stanford's ethics committee. A routine server migration had unearthed archived files from 2008, my original research with unaltered timestamps that definitively predated Vanessa's work. A new department chair, unfamiliar with the politics of the past, had ordered a review. They found overwhelming evidence of academic theft. "We'd like to formally reinstate your PhD candidacy," the committee chair explained. "With these materials, you could defend the original thesis. Stanford owes you that opportunity." That same week, Dad's assistant called about his retirement ceremony. After 35 years, he was stepping down as department chair. "He's been ill," she explained awkwardly. "Cancer. He's asked specifically for you to attend." The symmetry was almost too perfect. My father dying of cancer, just like my mother. A chance to reclaim my stolen work. A family reunion with the brother and the woman who had betrayed me, all coinciding with the first time I'd set foot on American soil in 17 years. 2 days before my flight to California, Ramira called with the final piece of the puzzle. "There's something you should know," she said. "The custom textbook you gave your father that night, it's been on his office desk for 17 years. He never unwrapped it until the cancer diagnosis. Now he carries it everywhere." As my plane descended toward San Francisco, I realized I wasn't returning for revenge or validation. I was coming back to reclaim something more valuable, my own narrative, the truth of who I was and what I had accomplished. Whether my father recognized that truth in his final days, whether Vanessa and Michael faced consequences for their actions, none of that would define me anymore. The woman who stepped off that plane wasn't the desperate, approval-seeking daughter who had fled years before. She was Dr. Ellie Hayes, respected neuroscientist, survivor of betrayal, architect of her own redemption, and she was finally ready to face the family that had failed her. I stand now at the lectern in Stanford's neuroscience auditorium, my original thesis defense finally complete 17 years late. The committee's unanimous approval feels like closing a circle rather than opening a door. My father sits in the front row, gaunt from treatment but alert, the custom textbook open on his lap. Vanessa and Michael hover at the back, their prestigious careers now shadowed by the university's formal ethics investigation. But their story is no longer the center of mine. Tomorrow, I fly back to Berlin, to my research team, my chosen family, the life I built from scratch. What I've learned is that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. No family legacy, no prestigious institution, no external validation can replace the quiet certainty of knowing your own worth. If you're watching this and something in my story resonates with you, remember, betrayal may bend you, but resilience can transform you. Your work, your ideas, your truth, they belong to you, even when others try to claim them. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and build something entirely new. If you found value in this journey, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of academic resilience and personal reinvention. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their worst moment doesn't have to define them. Because even when the evidence takes years to surface, the truth has a way of finding its voice.